According to the Book of Moses, a scriptural text within the Pearl of Great Price, a canonical work belonging to the Church of Latter-day Saints, we find an expansion on the biblical story of Cain, revealing a deeper and even more sinister dimension to his actions. In this account, Cain does not simply kill his brother Abel out of jealousy. Rather, he is corrupted by the devil and enters into a secret covenant with him in exchange for power. All Cain has to do to honor this wicked agreement is kill. This covenant marks the first instance of an organized secret combination established by the devil, a vague and yet equally ominous trope that not only isn't fully revealed to us, the reader, further adding to its intrigue, but also hints at an untold evil that may even still be prominent today. Secret handshakes, hidden gestures, surreptitious phrases, and maybe even some sort of subliminal code hardwired into us by Satan himself. No one has ever found out the truth about what this evil combination was, but that it was learned to its fullest by Cain, and it was passed down to some of his descendants. Central to this narrative is the title Master Mahan, which Cain receives after swearing his oath with Satan. This title, often interpreted as signifying mastery over the art of murder for personal gain, carries profound implications for the reader, for it not only adds an even more tainted layer upon the act of murder, but it also signifies an allegiance with the devil, perhaps even a descendancy to Cain. We find this concept of Cain's secret covenant with Satan existing solely within the narrative dictated by the Latter-day Saints prophet Joseph Smith, as late as June 1830 in his Book of Moses. The Book of Moses, sometimes dubbed as the Vision of Moses, serves some denominations of the Latter-day Saint movement as part of their scriptural canon, and makes up part of the greater Pearl of Great Price, the canonical standard works of Mormon religion. This work, believed by Latter-day Saints, was translated by Joseph Smith in an effort to restore several points and narratives that had been removed from the Standard Bible, or that were lost before its compilation. Interestingly, the sections that make up the Book of Moses were first published in church newspapers in the mid-19th century, where it was first realized by Latter-day Saints that Moses, a character not seen until Exodus in the traditional Bible, takes center stage in a prologue that sees the early events of Genesis told unto him by God. Much of the narrative remains the same, although with some slight variations. By the time Cain is born unto the world, we learn from this text that he's defiant from the very get-go. His mother Eve is shown to declare, "I have gotten a man from the Lord, wherefore he may not reject his words." And yet, the text supplements her declaration by telling us quite the opposite. "But behold, Cain hearkened not, saying, Who is the Lord, that I should know him?" As far as the text goes, Cain doesn't appear to be under the influence of Satan yet, but rather, there is something of a natural predisposition to wickedness in his reluctance to acknowledge God in the first place. By the time of Abel's birth, we learn that their roles within their family are the same as the traditional biblical accounts. Abel is a keeper of sheep. Cain is a tiller of the ground. Yet by this point, when they are old enough to work, the Book of Moses makes it clear where their allegiance lay. For we are told, Abel hearkened unto the voice of the Lord, whereas Cain loved Satan more than he loved God. In this same passage, we also learn that Satan began to command Cain, and that unlike the traditional biblical accounts, it is Satan that instigates the idea that Cain should make an offering unto the Lord, knowing full well how this would backfire and turn Cain bitter. The narrative shows us that Abel brought the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof to sacrifice to God, but Cain only brought the fruit of the ground. With this, God favoured Abel's offering and was far less impressed with Cain's. Just as Satan had anticipated, Cain becomes wroth with God's favouritism of Abel. Interestingly, just like the traditional Genesis account, we do see God try and save Cain, where he advises him that he should rise above Satan, for in this narrative he knew Satan wanted Cain, and that if Cain hearkened unto his commandments, he would be delivered, and in fact come to rule over Satan thereafter. However, God also warns Cain that if he doesn't make the right choice, and does throw in with Satan, then he would come to be known from that time forth as the father of lies, and that he would be known as perdition. In Christian theology, the term perdition can be defined as a state of eternal punishment, in which a sinful person who doesn't repent will pass through and remain after death. Cain essentially becomes the embodiment of this according to this Latter-day Saints tradition, as told by God in the Book of Moses. Whilst it isn't exactly clear, there is some suggestion here that Cain is threatened with a life of suffering, ultimately becoming the personification of perdition itself if he does not relinquish Satan and choose God. Cain, though, does not take these threats seriously, or at the very least, he finds more in common with Satan than God, and so ignores him. The Book of Moses tells us that he rejected the greater counsel from God, and that because of this, God did curse him there and then, before the murder of Abel even transpired. We are told, "And it shall be said in time to come that these abominations were had from Cain, for he rejected the greater counsel which was had from God, and this is a cursing which I will put upon thee, except thou repent." What's interesting in this account is that even though God can see where Cain is heading, he does still nonetheless offer him a way out, but reminds him that if he repents, then essentially all would be forgiven. In a way, you might say God was offering Cain a last final escape route from Satan, and all but encouraged him to use it before it was too late. Cain was shown to still be wroth with God, however, and he no longer listened to what the Lord had to say. In fact, according to this narrative, we are even told that Cain stopped talking to Abel too, because Abel, who walked with God, essentially spoke with God's voice, reminding Cain that it wasn't too late to renounce Satan, and that it was definitely in his best interest to do so. Unlike the traditional Genesis, the Book of Moses shows us a little more dysfunction in humanity's first family, that which Cain is the root cause of. We are told, Adam and his wife mourned before the Lord because of Cain. After having eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you might argue that no one knew the difference between right and wrong more than Adam and Eve, and so seeing their son choose Satan over God was no doubt a great disappointment. It's arguable that they even feared for Cain, for they had felt the wrath of God firsthand after being cast out of the Garden of Eden. They too had been deceived by Satan, so to see their eldest son repeat the same mistakes would have perhaps been all too much to bear, hence why they mourned before the Lord. Worse yet, Cain is shown to be more than just a murderer in this narrative, but something even more wicked. The Book of Moses tells us that he takes one of his brother's daughters, and not only marries her, but corrupts her into loving Satan too. It isn't clear from this text if this is one of Abel's daughters, or another unnamed brother born to Adam and Eve during that time, but assuming this is Abel's daughter, it goes to show how far Cain was willing to go to sow chaos into the family, all likely at the behest of Satan. Cain's wickedness is no longer exclusive to the slaying of his brother in this rhetoric, but rather now he is a conduit for disorder. He brings pain to his parents by disappointing them. He brings sadness to his brother by ignoring him, and then subsequently brings anguish by stealing away his daughter and turning her evil, and needless to say, he dismays God by not only acknowledging Satan, but by committing himself to him in entirety. The traditional Genesis account doesn't give us this level of understanding about Cain, so it's understandable that many proponents of Judaism and Christianity might ignore these additional characteristics. However, regardless of one's thoughts toward the Book of Moses and the Latter-day Saint movement in general, it can be argued that Cain is fleshed out here not just as a murderer, but a vessel for bedlam and havoc, perdition itself, if you will. What's more, the Genesis account does not imply that Cain was under the influence of Satan, but rather Cain was more of a bad seed than anything else. There are some apocryphal and Gnostic works that imply that Cain was the son of Satan, after Satan had tempted and subsequently seduced Eve, but neither the Genesis account nor the Book of Moses ever specify this as ever occurring. Instead, Satan is mostly absent from the Genesis account altogether, and Cain's wickedness is cultivated not from devilish engineering, but rather from simple human jealousy. The Book of Moses, though, shows us how Cain wasn't just jealous, but was actively incited and coerced by Satan, perhaps as early as his birth. By the time of his adulthood, we actually see him swear allegiance to Satan, as this covenant, if you will, is shown to be established between man and the devil. And Satan said unto Cain, Swear unto me by thy throat, and if thou tell it, thou shalt die. And swear thy brethren by their heads, and by the living God, that they tell it not. For if they tell it, they shall surely die. And this that thy father may not know it. And this day I will deliver thy brother Abel into thine hands. It's interesting that the first covenant we see established in the Genesis account is between Abraham and God, a holy covenant that transcends lineages and highlights exactly who God's chosen people are. Yet in the Book of Moses, the very first covenant that's established is an evil one that is later shown to work in a similar fashion to the Holy Covenant by marking chosen descendants of Cain to continue such wickedness. The wording of this covenant really hammers home the surreptitiousness of the pact, and is worth exploring for that alone. Unlike God, who promises Abraham fruitfulness, fatherhood, and generational greatness, Satan promises Cain the life of his brother, whom by this point, Cain undoubtedly despised. Yet, Satan's offer does not come without the underlying threat of violence. He makes Cain swear on his throat that if he ever spoke of the covenant to anyone, then both he and they would die. In some ways, it might be argued that the covenant wasn't meant to be shared, or that if it was shared, it would come at the expense of the sharer's life, who would need to ensure that the new inheritor of the secret covenant was well aware of the same rules. Why the secrecy, you may ask? Well, it's hard to say. Perhaps Satan wanted to keep it from those who were God-fearing, for if they knew of the covenant, then they might have been better equipped to steer clear of it, or may have been better guarded against its temptation if it was ever shared with them. For example, if the inheritor of the covenant decided to share it with someone God-fearing, they would then become the sole inheritor of the secret. But because they were righteous, they would not act on it, and thus the secret would never be passed on, and would essentially die with them, eradicating the covenant altogether. It's unlikely that Satan hoped to keep the covenant secret from God, considering God would have known about it regardless, so it seems plausible that the secrecy may have been a means to keep the rest of humanity in the dark, and so as to keep the evil covenant alive. In any case, the Book of Moses tells us that Cain swore unto Satan, and would do as he commanded, and all the things that Satan asked of Cain were indeed done in secret. Whilst Smith makes no effort to detail any of these commands by Satan, on the account that he probably didn't know, considering they were secret, it does lead readers to ponder on just what other terrible things Cain ended up doing, aside from shunning his family and stealing their daughters. It is here we get another interesting tidbit from the Book of Moses, where Cain addresses himself with a peculiar title not found in traditional biblical scripture. And Cain said, Truly, I am Mahan, the master of this great secret, that I may murder and get gain. Wherefore Cain was called Master Mahan, and he gloried in his wickedness. We'll dive into this term Mahan a little later, but for now, you might think of this title as either a self-appointed moniker by Cain, or a title awarded to him by Satan, that which is symbolic of he who was in possession of the secret, and he who had accepted this evil covenant. We also learn the principal nature of this covenant, that which enables the inheritor to achieve success or personal gain by killing another, possibly the killing of a rival, Abel in Cain's case. Cain does not hesitate nor show any signs of having second thoughts. He announces quite proudly that he is Mahan, the master of this great secret, and appears to fully understand the endeavour which he has chosen to undertake. There can be no misinterpreting of Cain's intentions here. He knows the path he takes is evil, and yet he does not stop himself. In fact, one might say he seems all the more eager, knowing that murder will bring him personal gain, even the murder of his own brother. The remainder of this section in the Book of Moses follows similarly to the traditional scripture, with some slight additions that further paint Cain as far more wicked. We see Cain lure his brother into the fields and strike him dead, but unlike the biblical account, we actually see Cain celebrate this siblicide. We are told, "And Cain gloried in what he had done, saying, I am free. Surely the flocks of my brother falleth into my hands." Once more, Cain glorifying the kill is not something we see in Genesis. Again, if anything, Cain goes from feigning ignorance of his brother's death to straight up panic, telling God that his punishment of banishment is more than he can bear. Yet here in the Book of Moses, the evil of Cain is only intensified. His lack of remorse is explicit. He is celebratory. He thinks not of the life he has taken, but instead of the flocks that he is bound to inherit. He uses the rather interesting adjective free to describe himself. Free from what, you might ask? Free from the shadow of Abel? Free from the favoritism shown by God to his brother? Free from his less glamorous role of tiller of the ground in comparison to the shepherd? Dare we suggest that he means free from Satan? Satan did promise to deliver Abel into his hands, under the presumption that Cain would inherit Abel's flock. So there is a possibility here that Cain had actually grown sick of Satan too, and wished for the whole deal to have been over and done with. Nowhere in the covenant did it say that it would last forever, unlike God's covenant with Abraham that was everlasting. So it could be argued that now that Cain had fulfilled his end of the bargain, he was now free to cast Satan aside too, and no longer had to answer to anyone. However, this can be disputed by referring to verse 28 of chapter 5 in the Book of Moses, where we are explicitly told that Cain and his wife loved Satan, and seeing as Satan had given Cain what he wanted, there is reason to believe they would have continued working together. As the narrative goes on, we do learn that Cain and Satan's plans are thwarted, because even though the murder of his brother was successful, Cain never does inherit the flocks, but rather loses everything as he is banished from the land. Interestingly, we see the loyalty of Cain is exactly what you'd expect it to be, virtually nil. For the moment God confronts Cain about Abel, Cain is quick to throw Satan under the bus. And Cain said unto the Lord, Satan tempted me because of my brother's flocks. Cain goes on to imply his anger got the better of him, that he was still bitter that God had chosen his brother's offerings over his. Just as the Genesis account shows us, Cain doesn't express sympathy or remorse for his actions, but rather tries to place the blame externally, whether it be his anger, Satan, or even God himself. The most amusing thing about this account is that Cain and Satan are illustrated as boys. They're pretty much best buddies as far as we can tell, and yet, the moment Cain gets confronted, Cain blames Satan for his transgressions, while Satan meanwhile is nowhere to be found. As is the case in Genesis, Cain is driven out from the face of the Lord, and sent to wander the earth as a vagabond and a fugitive. Ironically, he expresses his concerns about being killed by others in the wilderness, despite previously declaring himself as the Master Mahan, to which God places upon him the infamous mark, ensuring that any who slayed Cain would incur vengeance sevenfold. Subsequently, Cain, with his wife, proceeded to dwell east of Eden in the land of Nod, before eventually conceiving a son, who he named Enoch, and building a city in his name. As this conclusion for Cain is quite similar to the Genesis account, there are those who suggest that despite being banished, Cain was forgiven by God at some point, which is why he was allowed to not only have children, but also build his own city. In a sense, despite his atrocities, Cain appeared to cultivate his own independent success through these endeavours, though he never did actually acquire Abel's flocks, as was promised to him by Satan. With Cain's segment over, the Book of Moses moves over to his genealogy, explaining that from Cain came Enoch, from Enoch came Irad, and from Irad came Mehujael, and from Mehujael came Methusael, and from Methusael came Lamech. Even in the Genesis account, we are never given much information as to who these descendants of Cain really were, though there are some apocryphal sources that do attempt to enrich several of these characters. In the Book of Moses though, their characteristics remain ambiguous, with the exception of Lamech, who, as is the case in Genesis, is depicted as being a murderer. The Book of Moses tells us similarly to Genesis, "And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye, wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt." The Book of Moses doesn't reveal who these victims of Lamech are, other than one is a man to his wounding, and the other is a young man to his heart. In other words, one man wounded him and the other one hurt him. It might be said that Lamech acted in self-defense here, but his subsequent boast does make it seem that these murders were anything but. He states, "If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech shall be 70 and sevenfold." Much like Genesis, the Book of Moses frames Lamech as a man who is arrogant, brash, and not in the least respectful of God's words. If anything, Lamech mocks God's earlier testament that anyone who killed Cain would suffer vengeance 7 times over, and states that whoever tries to kill him will suffer vengeance 77 times over, suggesting that his vengeance was far more violent and effective than God's could be. This is the last we hear of Lamech in the Genesis account, but the Book of Moses supplies us with a deeper look at Lamech, who, would you believe it, had become the new Master Mahan. We are told, "For Lamech, having entered into a covenant with Satan, after the manner of Cain, wherein he became the Master Mahan, master of that great secret, which was administered unto Cain by Satan." Here we find out that the second person who inherited the covenant of Satan was indeed a descendant of Cain, which leads us to believe that not only had Satan failed to corrupt several generations in Cain's subsequent lineage, assuming he even tried, but that Cain had remained the sole Master Mahan in exile until this point. If we were to consult the apocryphal Book of Jasher, the identities of Lamech's victims are revealed to be Lamech's son, Tubal-Cain, and Cain himself. Whilst this is never detailed in the Book of Moses, there is some plausibility to it, whereby it can be said that if Lamech murdered Cain, he then inherited the covenant by committing a murder, as well as simultaneously eliminating the current Master Mahan from existence. Now, going by the account in the Book of Jasher, Lamech did not mean to kill Cain, but because he was old and blind, was said to have relied upon the guidance of his son Tubal-Cain to shoot Cain, who he mistook for a wild animal. The killing of Cain, therefore, could be described as an accident, and yet the implication is that Lamech inherited the covenant all the same, which then drove him into striking his son Tubal-Cain in anger, and thus murdering him too, as told to us in the Book of Jasher. With this in mind, it might be said that Lamech was either evil from the start, just like Cain, or that after inadvertently killing Cain, he was automatically corrupted by Satan, forced to adopt the covenant and made privy to the aforementioned secret combination, that which also enabled him to kill for personal gain. In any case, as the Book of Moses tells us, Satan was with Lamech now, and this might serve as a good enough explanation as to why Lamech is presented here as bolshy and conceited, as he brags about his own vengeance being greater than God's. You might remember that the original covenant between Cain and Satan specified that secrecy was of the utmost importance. If one spoke of the covenant and revealed it to others, they would certainly die. So you can imagine the predicament that Lamech found himself in when Irad, the son of Enoch, and Lamech's great-great-great-grandfather, came to learn of the secret himself. It isn't known exactly how Irad came to discover the covenant between Lamech and Satan. Perhaps Irad had overheard Lamech conversing with Satan, or perhaps God had told Irad in the hope that he could thwart Satan and stop him from ruining Lamech as he had done to Cain. In any case, Irad became aware of Lamech's secret, and he began to divulge it to the other sons of Adam. We can assume that Irad was God-fearing, and so it meant that Satan had no power over Irad. In essence, Irad was free to reveal the covenant to anyone, with no penalty to pay, that which he appeared to do. However, in doing this, it most definitely would have put Lamech in a tricky situation, who was now being exposed as a worker of Satan. Because it is believed that Lamech didn't tell anyone about the secret, but perhaps rather was caught in the act by Irad, he technically didn't break the terms of the agreement, meaning Satan could not punish him by taking his life. It also leads me to believe that the covenant itself was not as binding as one might think, and that Satan didn't really have any power to enforce the terms, let alone enforce punishments if they were broken. We know Satan as the master of lies, so it wouldn't be too far off the mark to suggest that for all we know, the covenant was just a very clever deception to keep his master Mahan under his control. Truthfully, in the same way Satan had the serpent trick Eve into eating the fruit, it's entirely possible that Satan also tricked Cain and Lamech into believing that he had the means to punish them if they did not adhere to his covenant. Still, Lamech probably wasn't willing to take that risk, and so when he realizes Irad is giving the game away, he kills him. We are told, "Wherefore Lamech, being angry, slew Irad, not like unto Cain, his brother Abel, for the sake of getting gain, but he slew him for the oath's sake." As we can see, Lamech didn't even kill Irad for personal gain, no. He killed him so as to protect the oath, so that he could continue operating under the shroud of secrecy, and to keep from breaching the contract he had made with Satan. Indeed, it does go to show how far Lamech was willing to go to keep in Satan's good graces, that he would willingly kill his own ancestor, not for wealth or for power, but simply to maintain the covenant, and possibly his own skin. Here we are also told, "For from the days of Cain there was a secret combination, and their works were in the dark, and they knew every man as his brother." This leads us to believe that at some point, the covenant was continued, possibly amongst the descendants of Lamech, and that it was shared amongst like-minded individuals who ultimately worked for Satan. Whoever these people were, they most likely operated outside of society, or at least had integrated into society under the guise of fellowship, but were in actuality murderers, amongst other terrible things. Once more, this secret combination is not revealed to us. It's likely that Joseph Smith had no idea either. Maybe even Irad was not privy to the details, but had only scraped the surface of the covenant. Therefore, when he revealed what he knew to the sons of Adam, they were able to expose Lamech of being in cahoots with Satan, but weren't able to prove much else. Another idea is that Lamech had killed Irad before Irad had the chance to divulge everything, which leads me to consider that he had murdered him right before their very eyes, as he was spilling the secrets. Indeed, it would have been the ultimate incrimination of his own guilt, and a blatant admission that he was in a covenant with Satan, but it did at least protect the finer details of the plot, those that Lamech was probably prepared to die with. After this transpires, God curses Lamech and all those who had covenanted with Satan. He then shunned them, as he did with Cain, Yet we are told that the abominations that they had made with Satan, these evil deeds, only increased amongst the sons of men. Indeed, we already learned Lamech's attitude towards God. We know he wasn't scared of the Lord, nor really even took his vengeance that seriously. So it comes as no surprise that he, and the rest of his ilk that had accepted Satan, continued to commit wickedness. We are told that soon after this, Lamech's wives left and rebelled against him, and that everyone despised him, to the point that he was taken from his home and banished, warned never to return amongst them, lest he be killed. It is ironic that the murderer, the Master Mahan, then becomes the one threatened with the very same punishment. In some capacity, it might be said that Satan had abandoned Lamech here, who no longer had the means to cause any more evil, especially as an old man, and so Satan surreptitiously jumps to a new ship, the Sons of Men, whom he incites to kill Lamech should he ever show his face again. This is only an idea, but it is interesting that after this, Lamech is never seen again, and it is the Sons of Men who are seen to begin the works of darkness, and start doing all kinds of terrible things that might have made even Lamech himself blush. These Sons of Men become so unruly and wicked that God is seen to curse the earth so that it doesn't grow anything, serving to punish humanity and possibly to make them see reason. This doesn't actually work though, and instead of scaring the Sons of Men into repenting, it really pushes them the other way, whereby they stop believing in him altogether. Whilst not explicitly stated in the Book of Moses, if this was the doing of Satan, who had come to corrupt more than one person at a time, then it would be true to say that he did get the upper hand over God here by turning his creations against him. This sets up the deluge narrative, where only Noah and his family are seen to be the righteous ones, and thus the chosen people to survive into the new world when the old sinful one was destroyed. So we've seen how both Cain and Lamech played into the hands of Satan. We've seen how both men came to hold the title of Master Mahan at some point. But we still don't really know what Master Mahan really meant. In fact, with Lamech being the final person associated with the Master Mahan title, it becomes a glaring curiosity and something of a theological concern that we don't know who became Master Mahan afterwards. Indeed, the tradition seemed to fade into obscurity, perhaps just as Satan had always intended, and whilst Lamech served to be a high-profile candidate on the account that he was exposed, whoever took over, as well as all subsequent masters, managed to keep it entirely under wraps. If you were to approach the term Master Mahan from a more non-religious perspective, it can be argued, as many commentators have, that Master Mahan was derived from the Master Mason, the highest degree of the Blue Lodge of Freemasonry. Freemasonry being something that Joseph Smith was all too familiar with, and most probably influenced by when it came to his translations. Another idea is that Smith used the term Mahan so as to associate it with the pejorative Mahun, believed to have been used to describe and insult the Prophet Muhammad during the Middle Ages. With Mahan being used to symbolize something akin to evil, it might be said that this was Smith's attempt to connect evil with Islam, or at the least to frame and connote the Islamic prophet with a moniker that served Satan. Those who defend the doctrine, however, argue that Smith had restored the term Master Mahan from missing parts of the Bible, though a suitable explanation for the term still remains uncertain amongst these apologists. The Church of the Latter-day Saints, meanwhile, argue that the term Mahan can mean several words, including mind, destroyer, or great one. So in effect, the Master Mahan could be the mastermind, again, one who is more akin to evil, or the Master Destroyer, he whose unbridled wickedness can see him inflict terrible destruction. The term Great One, meanwhile, may again be a reference to a person with the capacity for great evil, who, like Cain or Lamech, may have been handpicked by Satan to do his bidding. Whilst Cain was the first to bear the title of Master Mahan, using his pact with Satan to slay Abel and seize power, Lamech became the second, perpetuating the cycle of secret oaths and bloodshed. However, after Lamech, the identity of the Master Mahan is no longer explicitly recorded in scripture, leaving its legacy shrouded in mystery. This uncertainty raises important questions. Did the title continue to be passed down in secret? Has its principles manifested in different forms throughout history? Is there still a Master Mahan today? While the scriptures of the Latter-day Saints do not provide a definitive answer, the warning remains clear. Secret combinations, or covenants with the devil, once introduced, threaten societies across generations. The tale of Master Mahan serves as both a historical lesson and a cautionary symbol for believers, reminding them of the dangers of unchecked ambition, deception, and the hand of Satan on their shoulder, corrupting with his influence. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed the video, then please leave a like, as this does trick the algorithm into recommending more of my content. We're also really close to 1 million subscribers now, so if you want to help push us over the edge, then do smack that subscribe button and consider becoming a channel member. Until next time.